Adam Rowe's research and teaching focus on the intellectual, legal, and political history of the United States from the colonial era through the 19th century. He earned his Ph.D. and J.D. from the University of Chicago, where he has also served as a postdoctoral teaching fellow in the Social Sciences Division. In addition to his scholarly publications, Adam has published book reviews and essays in the Wall Street Journal, Compact Magazine, First Things, and other popular journals. Before returning to academia in 2024, Adam served as the federal judicial clerk for Judge J. Campbell Barker in the Eastern District of Texas.
Thank you all for coming, as Dr. Wheatland said. I always notice at conferences whenever I attend that there tend to be more people at the afternoon and cocktail hour than in the morning coffee hour. So congratulations to all of you for actually getting up and getting here on time. I appreciate it. Okay, so yeah, our topic today is federalism and republicanism. And I thought I'd start with a quote from a poem by Herman Melville. Melville is most famous as a novelist, Moby Dick, but he also tried his hand at poetry. And during the secession crisis in 1860 and 1861, he wrote the following: "Power unanointed may come, dominion unsought by the free, and the iron dome, stronger for the stress and strain, fling her huge shadow athwart the main. But the founder's dream shall flee." So what's he saying there? The Iron Dome, of course, is referring to the Capitol building, which is then being constructed. It's literally like there's scaffolding all around it, and it's half built. And what he's saying is that his worry is not that the nation is going to dissolve, that the nation is going to be destroyed by the secessionists. His fear is that the attempt to secede is going to provoke an assertion of power by the national government, by the centralized government, that is incompatible with the founders' theory and design. And this fear is that he's attributing this as the founder's dream is going to flee by this assertion of power, right? And I guess today, I think federalism still is a very important concept in American civic education and in our system. You can't really understand the American government and how it works without this idea of two sovereigns. But I don't think we today emphasize it nearly as much as something that is absolutely essential to the founders' concept of free government itself, and that is the key to their whole sense of achievement and what they had created. So I want to try to in my talk today kind of try to recover a little bit of why that is, why they thought this balance between central and local power, state and federal power, was so crucial to ordered liberty. And one way to think about this is that if you look at American history, political history, from the colonial era through to the Civil War, the great theme that confers an epic unity on this entire period that unites it is this question: is how do you reconcile the power and security and stability of a great empire like the British Empire with the political liberty that it inherently adheres only in autonomous communities and small communities. And so that is the question that is the question that the colonists are wrestling with in the imperial crisis that ultimately leads to the American Revolution. Right? The American colonists are not separatists at the beginning. They are proud and loyal British subjects who are trying to find a mechanism or a principle that will allow them to protect their traditional rights while as the rights that they have relied upon as colonists, and these are communal rights. These are the rights of Massachusetts. They have the rights of Virginians, with their loyalty as British subjects. And there are all kinds of ways in which they attempt to do this, right? They begin to talk about the distinction between internal and external taxation, right? That's one way of trying to do this. They refer to their colonial charters as having established certain basic rights that the English Parliament and King cannot infringe upon. They invoke the right to representation, that an English right to representation, no taxation without representation, right? Eventually Jefferson comes upon the theory that basically that the colonies are all united to the king, who has no legislative power, but the own with their colonial legislatures are in fact the equivalent of parliaments. So Parliament has absolutely no jurisdiction or authority over the colonies. And all of these, again, are attempts to try to find some way of saying, yes, we do belong to the British Empire, but we still have local rights, that there are certain rights that the central power cannot infringe upon, right? And again, it's only on July 4th, 1776, which is more than a year after the fighting had begun at Lexington and Concord, that they finally take the fatal step of saying, okay, we can't do it. We have to separate. So with separation, with independence, right, that basic constitutional argument, and it is a constitutional argument. They are having an argument with England over the British Constitution, right? it doesn't disappear. And in fact, it doesn't really even change. It just transfers to the American context, right? It's the same problem that they were having with Britain. Recurs in trying to organize their own national existence, right? And the first solution to this is the Articles of Confederation, right? And basically, it's not a very inspired or thought out solution. It's essentially just they make the states sovereign, and they kind of trust the states themselves to maintain the national existence through a kind of a view of enlightened self-interest. And spoiler alert, it didn't work, right? So it's at that point that they begin to, that they have to start to really think about how to kind of reconceptualize the national organization, how to once again reconcile local autonomy, the local rights of the existing states that have had a very long history, a very long distinctive history, with the power necessary to sustain a powerful, united national existence, right? And at that point, as they're doing this, really all the important constitutional innovation had been going on at the state level, right? And one of the most important of these is the Constitutional Convention, which is, we take it for granted today that there was a constitutional convention that framed the Constitution, but this idea that like there can be a lawmaking body that is higher than any of the constituted governments it creates is kind of an interesting one, right? I mean, it's not clear in what way a constitutional convention would be different than a legislature, right? And yet that is a very important innovation because it allows Americans to say, when you talk about the sovereignty of the people, you have to try to find some institutional way of making that a reality, right? Otherwise, the sovereignty is basically just the government, right? And that's the theory of the British Constitution, is that the people are sovereign through Parliament. That's what represents them, right? In America, we say no. Congress and the legislative body does not. It represents us only through the powers we've delegated through this higher lawmaking entity, which is the Constitutional Convention, that is then ratified by the people. And so as they are thinking about how to borrow these constitutional innovations that they've had, that have been going on at the state level into a national government, the framers of the Constitution begin to see this as an opportunity, this kind of crisis under the Articles of Confederation, of solving two of the great problems in politics, the most eternal problems in politics. One, as I've already mentioned, is how do you reconcile the power of a great empire and the security of a great empire with the political liberty that inheres in small communal republics. The other is how do you reconcile the right of majority to rule with the protection of minority rights, right? And they begin to see the federal system as the key to both of those issues, both of those problems. So, and to give you just a quick idea of what I think is one of the best statements of the founders' thought, I'll read for you just one quick paragraph from Henry Adams, the grandson of John Adams, or the great grandson of John Adams, and John Quincy Adams, the grandson of John Quincy Adams, and one of the greatest historians of the early republic. He writes, a quick water break. So. Henry Adams writes, "The great object of terror and suspicion to the people of the 13 provinces was power, not merely power in the hands of a president or a prince, or of one assembly or of several, of many citizens or of a few, but power in the abstract, wherever it existed and under whatever name it was known. There is and must be," said Blackstone, this is the great English British jurist who was often quoted during the American Revolution, "in all forms of government, however they began or by what right soever they exist, a supreme, irresistible, uncontrolled authority in which the rights of sovereignty reside." Supreme, absolute, uncontrollable authority, beyond which there is no appeal, as Blackstone said. And Parliament is the place, quote, "where that absolute despotic power, which must in all governments reside somewhere, is entrusted by the Constitution of the British kingdoms. Supreme irresistible authority must exist somewhere in every government," was the European political belief, and England solved her problem by entrusting it to the representative assembly to be used according to the best judgment of the nation. America, on the other hand, asserted that the principle was not true, and that no such supreme power need exist in a government, that in the American government none such should be allowed to exist, because absolute power in any form is inconsistent with freedom, and that the new government should start from the idea that the public liberties depended upon denying uncontrolled authority to the political system in its parts or in its whole. So that's the key idea here, right, is that First of all, there's the assumption that there is, in every government, the European experience, and this had come out of the civil wars of the 17th century and everything else, the European political thought had been that this idea of balanced constitutions and organic law and natural law, these things are all well and good as fictions. But basically, you got to figure out where power ultimately resides in any community. And if you're not very clear about that, you're going to discover it in blood, right? You're going to discover it in chaos and in war, and that's how it's going to be asserted. But Americans are asserting no. You can, in fact, create a system which limits absolute power everywhere, right? In its parts and in its whole. So the key idea here is that when and this is what the anti-federalists and then ultimately John Calhoun will also say, they'll say, look, either sovereignty resides in the states or the national government. You can't say it's not at one or the other, right? Sovereignty must be at one level or the other. And the nationalists are trying to transfer it to a national government. The nationalists didn't say that. The nationalists said, no, the people are going to retain their sovereignty. And the key here is that, and under the Articles of Confederation, the problem is that the states can do whatever they want. The national government is clearly inferior in power to the state governments. We're going to create a system in which there is no superior, right? In which the law that we create, the Constitution, is supreme. But no, the Constitution as supreme does not create a supreme power at one level or another. And that's the key innovation here that the founders think that they have hit upon. As John Jay wrote, the American people are sovereigns without subjects. And I'll add, I think that the two kind of animating concepts that help understand the American commitment to federalism at the founding are sovereignty and their idea of how they've kind of, in some sense, either eliminated that idea or kind of proven that the European concept of sovereignty is not true, that you don't need a sovereign power entrusted to the state, or taking it back and giving it to retained by the people. And then the other is self-government, right? That's the other, and that's a phrase that Lincoln is most fond of using. He doesn't talk about democracy. Lincoln will talk about self-government, right? Because democracy has been tried many places. That's just the majority has absolute power. But self-government implies something else, something more interesting and elusive, I think. But anyway, as John Jay wrote, the American people are sovereigns without subjects, right? So here, there basically is there's no relationship of a state and its subjects, or a monarch and the subjects. The people themselves are sovereigns as a political community. In his famous reply to Calhoun, Daniel Webster wrote, no such idea is known in North America, as the sovereignty of the government is an idea that ultimately belongs on the other side of the Atlantic. So again, the key point here is that Calhoun is saying basically the states are sovereign, and that's why the states ultimately have a right of nullifying a federal law. Webster, in his reply, and the nationalist reply, is not that the national government can do whatever it wants, that ultimately there is no appeal from it, right? It is simply that the American people themselves are sovereign, and that they have a duty to obey the Constitution. It is not one of, the challenge for the nationalists is that Calhoun has a very clear idea. It's just like the state is sovereign, whereas the nationalist position is a more interesting but also more difficult political idea. And here is Justice James Wilson in the famous case of Chisholm versus Georgia. He writes, the only reason I believe why a free man is bound by human laws is that he binds himself, right? And so there, I think, is one of the best concepts, best statements of what self-government means, which is that it is not that you have that you obey a power superior to yourself. It is that, and it's not that you have the right to do whatever you want, right? It is that you voluntarily bind yourself to a law, and that's self-government. It's not the right of the people to do whatever they want, or the majority to rule as they will. It's a more difficult process and problem of both assertion and restraint, right? The people have to have enough self-assertion to insist on their rights, but they also have to have enough restraint to obey a law that no one is commanding them to obey, no one can force them to obey. And at the same time, right, the federal system assumes that the way that you inculcate this virtue is by leaving as much as possible for people to resolve, to deal with themselves. The government should only get involved when people cannot, go for those things that the people cannot do for themselves. And that is also very important as a federal principle, because it means that basically whatever a local government can do, it should do on its own. It shouldn't look to a national government, nor should the national government insist on imposing itself. So as the political theorist Francis Lieber wrote, without local self-government, in other words, self-government consistently carried out and applied to the realities of life, and not remaining a mere general theory, there is no real self-government. Self-government is founded on the willingness of the people to take care of their own affairs and the absence of that disposition which looks to the general government for everything, as well as on the willingness in each to let others take care of their own affairs. It cannot exist where the general principle of interference prevails. And you'll be hard-pressed to find any principle that has more kind of universal acceptance among American nationalists in the early republic than this one, right? It's that you have a national government that exists for national interests and national affairs, right? And particularly, foreign policy, interstate commerce, things like that. But basically, anything that pertains to a particular state should be done by that state, and there is no reason or power for the federal power to intervene in that. And again, I'll flag just the important part of the Constitution where this is most manifest, which is the statement that this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. So you can often read that to mean that it basically makes the federal government supreme, but it doesn't quite, right? Because it says that the Constitution and the laws which shall be made in pursuance thereof. So if a law is not in pursuance of the Constitution, if it is unconstitutional, it is not a supreme law of the land. And a state has not only the right but the duty to say so, right? The problem, of course, is that it doesn't. The key here is that it doesn't actually say that state officials or federal officials have a superior ability to comment on what the Constitution is. Everyone has the duty to read and understand the Constitution for themselves. And there is a challenge here, right? Which is that as the British English political philosopher Walter Bagehot wrote in his book on the English Constitution, he said the Americans like to say that the people are sovereign. But when in a quick crisis, when you most need the sovereign power, you cannot find the sovereign people, right? To say that the people are sovereign is, in a sense, to say, it exists everywhere and nowhere at the same time, right? It is much harder, and we see this during the Civil War, where everybody's kind of arguing about what the Constitution says, but it's not clear who has ultimate power in that situation. So I wanted to conclude just by saying, especially in the aftermath of the Civil War, we tend to look, historians and a lot of political theorists will look at the early republic as being as a curiously incomplete system, right? Like in the Capitol itself sometimes symbolizes this, right? It's like half built. That they tend to think of this as being a system that had been pushed to a certain point, but that the federal system had not kind of been developed to its logical endpoint. And I don't think that's correct. And the historian Alan Nevins, one of the great historians of the 20th century, wrote of the American Republic right before the Civil War. He said that as a nation, the country was as invertebrate as a jellyfish, right? There is no central spine kind of holding this country together. It's all just sort of diffuse. And I think that's an accurate statement, or a somewhat accurate statement of the situation in the antebellum period. But I don't think it's because the theory was wrong. It's just that in the antebellum period, they had failed to kind of realize the political process that the founders had set in motion. So the framers of the Constitution did not create by creating a federal system that basically withholds ultimate authority from any part of the government, the founders were creating a political process without a clear destination. It was for Americans themselves to fulfill this political process. As the great historian Jack Rakov writes, if one treats federalism solely as a legal arrangement for dividing the sovereign powers of government without measuring the alternating political currents that flow along its complicated circuitry, its essential character will remain elusive. And I'll end with two final quotations. One is from Madison, which gets at the kind of novelty of the political experiments the founders had created, right? And it was always conceptualized as an experiment, right? They were doing something that was fundamentally new, that had never been tried before. And as he says, But why is the experiment of an extended republic to be rejected merely because it may comprise what is new? Is it not the glory of the people of America that whilst they have paid a decent regard to the opinions of former times and other nations, they have not suffered a blind veneration for antiquity, for custom, or for names to overrule the suggestions of their own good sense, the knowledge of their own situation, and the lessons of their own experience? So he is saying it's the proud boast of Americans that we are developing something fundamentally new. And the idea of the state, of the territorial sovereign state, had emerged, as intellectual historians say, like in the 16th century. So the Americans had this idea of like the territorial sovereign state, but they thought they were creating something, a new kind of theory of political organization. It's an irony that we sometimes look back at this period as one in which we see the Americans trying to develop that which they thought they were moving beyond, right? That the war itself kind of forced them to do. And so here I'll conclude with a prose version of the poem I began with, right? This is Francis Lieber writing at the exact same time as Herman Melville in 1860 and 61. And he writes, by way of prophecy, "One thing seems certain," Lieber said, "if ever the American people should be forced to make a choice between a unitary government and an unmitigated confederacy, they would be obliged to select the former type," right? So if we're forced to choose between a centralized nation and one that is completely, that there is no central power, we will be obliged to create a centralized power. But that choice didn't necessarily have to be permanent, right? We can still take inspiration from the founders' aspirations and vision, even if that vision, at least temporarily, proved a failure. Thanks.
Join us in falling in love with America again.